Most of the things that have ever scared me didn't look dangerous when they began. They felt normal, routine, almost forgettable. I think that's what makes them harder to recognize because we trust the places we're used to and the people we don't expect to question. At the time, nothing stands out. Nothing feels like a warning. It's only later, when you go back through it in your head, that the small details start to feel different. These aren't the kind of stories where something impossible happens. They're the kind where everything makes sense, right up until it doesn't. And that's what stays with you. I didn't realize it at the time, but every one of these moments started the same way. Just a normal day, a normal decision, something small that didn't seem worth thinking twice about. Looking back, that's the part that bothers me the most. Because if I had paid attention to those first few signs, even the ones that didn't fully make sense, things might have turned out differently. Story one started the same way. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Just a simple interaction that should have ended in a few minutes, but didn't, not at all. Story one. Set up a normal interaction. This happened a little over a year ago when I was getting ready to move out of my apartment. It wasn't anything major, just relocating closer to work, but I had accumulated more stuff than I realized. Most of it I didn't want to take with me, so I decided to sell a few things online instead of throwing them out. I've always been pretty practical about stuff like that. I'm not the kind of person who gets overly cautious or paranoid. I've used online marketplaces before, met people, exchanged items, and it's always been straightforward. Quick messages, a short meet, and that's it. This time I listed a small desk. Nothing expensive, just something I'd been using in the corner of my living room. Within a couple of hours, someone messaged me. The conversation was normal at first. He asked if it was still available, what condition it was in, and if I could lower the price slightly. Nothing unusual. We agreed to meet later that afternoon. I suggested a public place nearby, a small parking area next to a convenience store about 5 minutes from my building. It was somewhere I'd passed by dozens of times. There were always a few cars, people coming and going, nothing isolated or quiet. The weather that day was clear, a little warm but not uncomfortable. It was still early enough that everything felt active, like a normal part of the day. I remember thinking it was a good time to get this done quickly. When I got there, I was a few minutes early. I parked near the front, where it was more visible, and waited. A couple of people walked in and out of the store. Cars pulled up, left again. Everything felt exactly how it should. He arrived about 10 minutes later. His car pulled in slowly, not in a way that stood out, but just enough that I noticed it before he parked. He chose a spot a little further away from the entrance than I expected, closer to the side of the lot where there were fewer cars. At the time, I didn't think much of it. He got out and walked over, and the first thing I noticed was that he seemed overly friendly. Not aggressive, not pushy, just a little too eager. He smiled a lot, talked quickly, and kept saying things like, "I really appreciate you meeting me," more times than necessary. I told myself he was probably just trying to be polite. We talked for a bit while I showed him the desk. He asked a few questions, but not really about the item, more about me. How long I'd lived in the area, where I worked, whether I was moving far. Again, nothing that crossed a clear line. Just slightly more personal than I was used to. I answered casually, trying not to make it awkward. There were small pauses in between, moments where he would just look at me a second longer than expected before saying something else. It wasn't enough to call out, but it was noticeable if you paid attention. At one point, he laughed at something I said, but it felt delayed, like he hadn't really been listening. Still, everything on the surface was normal. No raised voices, no sudden movements, no obvious reason to feel uncomfortable. Looking back, there was something slightly off about the whole interaction. Not in a way I could explain at the time, just a quiet feeling that something didn't quite fit. But it was easy to ignore. At first, it didn't feel like a big deal. The conversation was still light, and nothing he said was directly inappropriate. But the longer it went on, the more I started to notice how little it had to do with the desk. He barely looked at it anymore. Instead, he kept asking small, personal things. Not in a direct way, more like slipping them in between normal questions. He asked if I lived nearby, then followed it with how long I'd been there. A minute later, he asked if I lived alone, but phrased it casually, like he was just making conversation. I answered without thinking too much about it. It's the kind of thing people ask all the time. But there was something about the way he listened that felt off. He wasn't just hearing the answer, he was holding on to it. There were these pauses too. Moments where the conversation would just stop and he'd look at me without saying anything, not in an aggressive way, just longer than normal. Long enough that I feel the need to fill the silence. I remember glancing around the parking lot at one point, almost instinctively. It hadn't emptied out completely, but it felt quieter than when I arrived. Fewer cars, fewer people moving in and out of the store. The kind of shift you don't notice happening until it already has. He noticed me looking. Everything okay? He asked, smiling again. I nodded, said, yeah, just checking the time. It wasn't true, but it felt easier than explaining why I suddenly felt a little uneasy. That's when he suggested we move. He said it casually, like it was no big deal. Mentioned that his car was parked further out and asked if I could help him carry the desk over there. It wasn't an unreasonable request. The desk wasn't heavy, just awkward to carry alone. But something about it made me hesitate. I told him I could bring my car closer instead, keep things simple. He paused for a second, just a brief moment, but I caught it. That same delay from earlier, like he was adjusting to something not going the way he expected. Then he smiled again, a little tighter this time, and said that would work too. We moved the cars closer together, but even then he didn't seem in a hurry to finish. He kept talking, dragging the conversation out, asking more questions that didn't really connect to anything. At one point, he asked what time I usually got home from work, then quickly followed it with something else, like he was trying to cover it up. That was the first moment I actually felt something shift. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awareness. Like I was suddenly paying attention in a way I hadn't been before. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. People say awkward things all the time. Not everyone is good at small talk. Still, I started trying to wrap things up. I told him I had somewhere to be, that I needed to get going soon. He nodded but didn't move any faster. If anything, he slowed down, taking his time looking over the desk again, like he was reconsidering it. Then he asked if I could knock a little more off the price. It wasn't a big amount, but it felt unnecessary. We'd already agreed on something earlier. I hesitated, then just said sure, figuring it was easier than dragging it out even longer. He smiled again, but this time it didn't feel friendly. It felt like something else, something I couldn't quite place. As we lifted the desk, he adjusted his grip in a way that forced me to step closer to him. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The space between us felt smaller than it needed to be. I remember thinking, just for a second, that I wanted this to be over. That's when he said, almost casually, that he might need help getting it inside his place too. He mentioned it like it was already decided, like the interaction wasn't ending here. And that's when the feeling in my stomach changed completely. I told him I wouldn't be able to help bring it inside. I kept my tone casual, like it wasn't a big deal, just something I didn't have time for. For a second, he didn't respond. He just stood there holding his side of the desk, looking at me again in that same quiet, focused way. Then he set his end down. Not abruptly, not aggressively. Just slowly, like he had decided something. That's okay, he said, but he didn't step back. Instead, he moved slightly to the side, putting himself between me and my car. It wasn't obvious at first. If you glanced at us, it probably looked like we were just standing there talking. But when I shifted my weight, trying to move around him, he adjusted too, almost without thinking. That was the moment it stopped feeling normal. I remember my chest tightening, not panic exactly, but something close. The kind of feeling where your body reacts before your mind fully catches up. I said I needed to grab something from my car, keeping my voice steady. He didn't argue, but he didn't move either. Just watched me for a second longer, then stepped aside, but only just enough to let me pass. I walked to my car without rushing, even though everything in me wanted to move faster. I opened the door, leaned in like I was looking for something, and that's when I glanced back. He hadn't moved far. He was still standing there, facing me, not checking his phone, not looking around. Just watching. That was enough. I got into the car and closed the door immediately. I didn't look at him again after that. I just started the engine and pulled out of the spot faster than I meant to. As I drove past, I saw him in the mirror, still standing there, still watching. He didn't try to stop me, he didn't follow, but I kept driving anyway, longer than I needed to, just putting distance between myself and that parking lot. Even now, I can't say for sure what he intended. Maybe it was nothing, maybe I misread it, but the way it felt in that moment, that sudden shift from normal to something else, that wasn't nothing. I didn't go straight home after that. I just kept driving for a while, not really thinking about where I was going, just needing distance. It took a few minutes before the feeling in my chest started to settle, but even then it didn't fully go away. When I finally did stop, I just sat there in the car, replaying everything in my head. Nothing that happened was extreme. There wasn't a clear moment where something obvious crossed the line. But the more I thought about it, the more those small details started to stand out. The questions that didn't need to be asked. The way he paused before responding. The way he positioned himself without making it obvious. It was all subtle, but it added up. I remember feeling a kind of quiet shock, not because something had happened, but because of how close it felt to something that could have. That's the part that stayed with me. The idea that if I had ignored that feeling just a little longer, or tried to be polite instead of leaving, things might have gone differently. There was also this slight guilt, like I should have noticed sooner. Like the signs were there, just easy to dismiss. Nothing about it seemed dangerous at the beginning. That's what made it so easy to step into. Story 2. Set up trust and relationship. The second story feels different when I think about it. Mostly because it didn't involve a stranger. It was someone I knew, someone I lived with for a while, which made everything harder to recognize at the time. I moved into that apartment with him about 6 months after the first situation. It was a shared place, nothing special. Just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room we barely used. We had met through a mutual friend who said he was easy to get along with, reliable, quiet. That was enough for me. At first, everything was exactly how you'd expect. We both had our own routines. I worked during the day and got back in the early evening. He had a slightly different schedule, sometimes leaving late, sometimes staying in. We didn't spend all our time together, but there was enough overlap that it felt comfortable. We'd talk in the kitchen while making food, watch something occasionally, or just sit in the same space without needing to say much. He was the kind of person who didn't demand attention. Quiet, but not in a way that felt awkward. More like he kept to himself, which I actually preferred. It made the whole living situation feel easy. There were small habits you get used to when you share a place with someone. The way he made coffee every morning, even on days he didn't seem to be going anywhere. The fact that he always left the hallway light on at night, the sound of his door opening and closing at specific times. It all blended into something normal. Looking back, I think that's why the changes were so easy to miss. At first, it was just little things. He started staying up later than usual. I'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and notice the light under his door still on. It didn't seem strange on its own. People have different sleep patterns. Then there were moments where conversations didn't quite line up. I'd mentioned something we talked about the day before, and he'd act like it never happened. Not in a defensive way, just casually brushing it off or changing the subject. I told myself I probably remembered it wrong. There were also small shifts in how he reacted to things. Sometimes he'd seem completely normal, even friendly. Other times he'd respond in a way that felt slightly disconnected, like he wasn't fully present in the conversation. Nothing extreme. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I wasn't, at least not at first. Living with someone naturally builds a kind of trust. You share space, routines, and over time, you stop questioning the small things. You assume everything has a reasonable explanation. That's what I did. I didn't think much of the late nights or the forgotten conversations. I didn't question why he sometimes stood in the hallway for a few seconds before going back into his room. I barely registered it. It all felt like normal variation in someone's behavior. But there was a point, a specific moment I can still picture clearly, where that started to shift. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just a small interaction in the kitchen, something he said that didn't quite match the situation. I remember the way he looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for a reaction that I didn't give. That's when things started to change. Not all at once, but enough that I began noticing more than I had before. After that moment in the kitchen, I started paying closer attention, not in an obvious way, just noticing things I probably would have ignored before. It was mostly at night. I'd wake up sometimes, not fully, just enough to be aware of the apartment. At first, it was small things. The sound of movement in the hallway, floorboards shifting slightly, like someone was walking slowly, trying not to make noise. I assumed it was him getting water or going to the bathroom. That's normal. But it didn't always line up. There were nights where I'd hear movement, then check the time, and it would be 3 or 4 in the morning. The next day, I'd casually mention something like, "You were up late," and he'd look at me like he didn't know what I meant. "I slept early," he'd say, without hesitation. At first, I thought maybe I was half asleep and misheard something. That happens. Your brain fills in gaps when you're not fully awake. But then it kept happening. One night, I remember waking up more clearly. There was a faint light coming from the hallway, which was strange because we usually turned everything off before going to bed. I sat up for a second, listening. The apartment felt quiet, but not empty. There's a difference you can feel, even if you can't explain it. I got up, opened my door slightly, and looked out. The hallway light was on, but there was no one there. His door was closed. I stood there for a few seconds, just looking, waiting to hear something, but nothing happened. Eventually, I just assumed he had turned it on earlier and gone back to his room. The next morning, I asked him about it. He told me he hadn't left his room at all. He said it so casually that it made me question whether I had even gotten up in the first place. That's how it kept going. Small things. Easy to dismiss on their own, but harder to ignore when they kept repeating. Objects would be slightly out of place. Not moved in a way that was obvious, just enough that I'd notice. A cup I left on the counter would be on the other side of the sink. A chair would be angled differently than I remembered. Once I found my keys on the kitchen table when I was sure I had left them in my room. Every time I brought something up, he'd deny it, not aggressively, not defensive. Just calmly, like there was nothing to question. "I didn't touch that. I don't know what you mean. You probably moved it and forgot." And the worst part was, it sounded reasonable. There's a point where you start questioning your own memory more than someone else's behavior. I think back, trying to remember exactly where I left something, what I said, what I heard, and the more I tried to be sure, the less certain I felt. He also started spending more time just watching, not in an obvious confrontational way. It was subtle. I'd be in the kitchen doing something and I'd feel it before I saw it. That sense that someone is looking at you. When I'd turn, he'd already be there, standing in the doorway or leaning slightly against the wall. Sometimes he'd say something normal, like asking what I was making. Other times he'd just stay quiet for a second too long before speaking. His timing felt off. Conversations didn't flow the way they used to. There were gaps, pauses that didn't belong. Sometimes he'd respond to something I hadn't said yet, like he was anticipating it. Other times he'd completely miss what I was talking about, even though he was looking directly at me. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe he wasn't sleeping well. Maybe I was reading too much into it because of what had happened before with that other situation. But the feeling kept building. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. More like a constant, low-level awareness that something wasn't right. Like the apartment didn't feel the same as it used to, even though nothing obvious had changed. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is when it became a problem. It was just a pattern. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore. It happened on a night that didn't feel any different from the others. I went to bed at a normal time, nothing unusual. Just the same routine I'd been following for months. I remember checking my phone for a bit, turning off the light, and falling asleep without anything about anything particular. Sometime later, I woke up. Not suddenly, not from a noise, just that gradual awareness where you realize you're not asleep anymore. The room was dark, except for a faint light coming from the hallway, slipping through the small gap under my door. For a few seconds, I just lay there, not moving. That same feeling was back. The one I couldn't really explain, just a quiet sense that something wasn't right. I told myself to ignore it. I closed my eyes again, tried to settle back into sleep, but it didn't work. The longer I stayed still, the more aware I became of the silence around me. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. After a minute or two, I opened my eyes again and turned my head slightly toward the door. That's when I noticed it. The door wasn't fully closed. It was open just enough that I could see into the hallway. And for a second, my mind didn't process what I was looking at. Then it did. He was standing there, just outside my room in the hallway, facing inward, not moving, not saying anything. Just standing there, close enough that if he took a single step forward, he'd be inside. I didn't react right away. I think part of me was still trying to understand it, to fit it into something normal. Maybe he was about to knock. Maybe he thought I was awake. But he didn't move. I stayed completely still, pretending I hadn't seen him, hoping he would just leave. Seconds passed, maybe longer, and he was still there, watching. There was something about the way he stood that didn't feel casual. His posture was too still, too deliberate. Like he had been there for a while. I could feel my breathing starting to change, getting shallower without me meaning to. I kept my eyes half closed, just enough that I could still see him without making it obvious. Then, quietly, he spoke. I know you're awake. His voice was calm, not aggressive, not raised. Just flat, like he was stating something obvious. I didn't respond. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched out, heavy in a way that made it hard to think. Then he took a small step forward. Not enough to fully enter the room, but enough that he was closer than before. Close enough that I could see his face more clearly in the dim light. He didn't look angry. That's what made it worse. His expression was neutral, almost curious, like he was observing something, waiting for a reaction. Do you hear it too? He asked. The question didn't make sense. I felt this sudden, sharp confusion, like my brain was trying to catch up to something it couldn't quite understand. Hear what? I almost said, but I stopped myself. Something about the way he asked it made me feel like answering would make things worse. So I stayed quiet. Another pause. Then he tilted his head slightly, still looking at me. It's louder at night, he said. Again. Matter of fact, like this was a normal conversation. At that point, the fear finally settled in, not from what he said, but from the situation itself. The fact that he was standing there in the middle of the night, watching me, talking like this was normal. I didn't know what he meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I finally moved slowly, sitting up just enough to make it clear I was awake. I told him, as evenly as I could, that I didn't hear anything and that I was trying to sleep. For a second, he just looked at me. Then, just as quietly as he had come, he stepped back. He didn't say anything else. He turned, walked down the hallway, and disappeared into his room, closing the door behind him. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. The next morning felt strangely normal, which somehow made it worse. I got up later than usual, mostly because I hadn't really slept. The apartment was quiet, no different than any other day. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there, making coffee like he always did. He looked at me and said, "Good morning." Nothing about his tone or expression suggested that anything had happened the night before. No hesitation, no acknowledgement, nothing that even hinted at it. I stood there for a second, trying to decide if I should bring it up. Part of me wanted to ask him directly, to force some kind of explanation. But the other part, the stronger part, didn't want to hear whatever answer he might give. So I didn't say anything. I just nodded, grabbed what I needed, and kept the interaction as short as possible. After that, things changed quickly. I started spending less time in the apartment. I'd stay out longer than usual, come back later, avoid being in shared spaces if I knew he was around. When I was there, I kept my door closed. We stopped talking unless it was necessary. He didn't question it. If anything, he seemed completely unaffected, like the distance didn't matter to him at all. Within a couple of weeks, I made the decision to leave. I told him it was because of work, that I needed to be closer to a different area. He accepted it without asking many questions. There was no argument, no attempt to change my mind. The day I moved out, he helped carry a few boxes to my car. He acted the same as he always had. Calm, quiet, normal. That was the last time I saw him. I never got an explanation for what happened that night. I don't know what he meant, or why he was standing there, or how long he had been watching before I woke up. And even now, I still think about it sometimes. Not because of what he said, but because of how normal everything felt around it. I still don't know what was wrong. Story 3. Setup, safe place turns wrong. The third story happened a few months after I moved out of that apartment. By then, things had settled down a bit. I had a new place, a different routine, and for the most part, I wasn't thinking about any of it anymore. This was supposed to be something simple. Just a short trip out of town for a couple of days. I booked a small place through a rental app. It wasn't a hotel, more like a private unit attached to someone's house. The listing looked normal. Clean photos, good reviews, nothing that stood out in a bad way. If anything, it seemed like a quiet, comfortable place to stay. When I arrived, it matched the pictures almost exactly. The property was in a calm neighborhood, not too far from the main road, but tucked away enough that it felt private. There were a few houses nearby, spaced out just enough that you couldn't hear much from one to the other. The unit itself was on the side of the main house with its own entrance, a small door that opened into a compact living space. As soon as you walked in, there was a couch against one wall, a small table, and a kitchenette tucked into the corner. To the left was a short hallway that led to the bedroom and bathroom. It felt simple but comfortable. The host greeted me briefly when I arrived. He seemed normal, maybe a little quiet, but polite. He showed me where everything was, mentioned that he'd be in the main house if I needed anything, and then left me alone. At first, everything felt exactly how it should. I unpacked a few things, set my bag near the bed, and took a quick look around. The place was clean, organized, nothing out of place. The windows faced a small backyard, and there was a faint sound of wind moving through trees outside. It was quiet in a way that felt relaxing. That first evening was uneventful. I ordered some food, watched something on my phone, and settled in without thinking too much about where I was. It felt temporary, like any other short stay. Just a place to sleep. But there were small things I noticed even early on. Nothing obvious. Just details that didn't quite fit together perfectly. The layout felt slightly off. Not in a way that made it unusable, just something about how the hallway connected to the bedroom. It was narrower than it should have been, and the door to the bedroom didn't open all the way without brushing lightly against the wall. I told myself it was just the way the place was built. There were also sounds at night, not loud, not constant, just occasional, faint noises that were hard to place. At first, I assumed it was coming from outside, maybe the trees or something shifting in the main house, but the timing felt strange. The sounds didn't follow a pattern. They would happen, then stop completely, then start again after a long pause. Sometimes it sounded like a soft movement, like something lightly brushing against the surface. I didn't think much of it that first night. Places always sound different when you're not used to them. Every building has its own noises. The second day was normal too. I went out, came back in the afternoon, and everything was exactly how I left it. Nothing moved, nothing missing, nothing out of place. Still, that same feeling from before started to settle in, slowly. Not fear, just awareness. Like something about the place wasn't as simple as it looked. There was one moment later that evening that stood out more than the others. I was in the kitchen area getting a glass of water when I noticed the door to the hallway was slightly more closed than I remembered leaving it. It wasn't fully shut, just a small difference in position. I'd paused for a second, trying to remember if I had touched it earlier. I couldn't be sure. So I left it. But that was the first time I actually stopped and thought about it. And once that thought was there, it didn't really go away. That night, I told myself I was just overthinking it. New places always feel different. You notice things you normally wouldn't, especially when it's quiet. Every small sound stands out more than it should. That's what I kept repeating to myself as I got ready for bed. I turned off the lights, lay down, and tried to settle into the same routine as the night before. For a while it worked. Then the sound started again. At first it was faint. Something like a soft shift, almost like fabric brushing against the surface. I stayed still, listening, trying to place it. It didn't sound like it was coming from outside this time. It felt closer, somewhere within the unit. I waited, expecting it to stop. It didn't. The sound came again, slightly different, like a light tap followed by a pause. Then nothing for a few seconds, then again. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The room looked the same as before. Nothing out of place, nothing moving. I told myself it could be pipes or the building settling. Old places make noise, especially at night when everything else is quiet. That explanation made sense. So I lay back down. A few minutes passed, and just as I started to drift again, I heard it. A soft, controlled movement. Not random. Not something loose shifting or settling. Something deliberate. I froze. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the hallway. Not loud, but clear enough that I couldn't pretend it was coming from outside. I turned my head slightly toward the bedroom door. It was still in the same position, slightly open. I stared at it for a while, waiting for it to move. It didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself that if something was actually there, I would see it. The fact that nothing changed meant it was probably nothing. That's how I got through the rest of the night. The next morning, everything looked normal. Again. I checked the hallway, the bathroom, even the small closet space. Nothing was out of place. No signs that anything had moved. I almost felt relieved. But then it happened again that afternoon. I had stepped outside briefly, just to grab something from my car. I was gone for less than 5 minutes. When I came back in, the air inside felt slightly different. It's hard to explain, but it was like walking into a room that someone had just left. I paused near the door, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just a shift in temperature, maybe the air from outside mixing with the inside. I locked the door behind me and walked further in. That's when I noticed the hallway door again. This time, it was more closed than before. Not by much, just enough that I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I stood there for a second, staring at it, trying to remember exactly how it had been when I left. I couldn't be certain, and that uncertainty made it easy to dismiss. Still, I pushed it open fully this time, just to be sure. The hallway was empty. The bedroom was exactly how I left it. Nothing missing, nothing moved. But the feeling didn't go away. Over the next several hours, small things kept happening. A faint sound when I wasn't expecting it. A shift in position of something I thought I remembered clearly. A sense, every now and then, that I wasn't completely alone in the space, even though I knew that didn't make sense. I kept trying to explain it. Maybe the host had access to the unit. Maybe he came in while I was out to check something and I just didn't notice any real changes. That felt like the most logical explanation. But if that was true, why didn't anything look disturbed? Why were the changes so small, so specific? That night, I left the hallway door completely open. I told myself it was just so I wouldn't have to think about it. But really, it was because I wanted to know if it would move again. I lay in bed, staring at the open doorway, waiting. And for a long time, nothing happened. Just silence. Just the same quiet, still environment. Then, slowly, almost carefully, the door shifted. Not all at once. Just a slight movement. Enough to notice. Enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. And in that moment, every explanation I had been holding on to started to fall apart. I didn't move right away. I just lay there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself there was still some explanation I hadn't thought of. Maybe it hadn't moved as much as I believed. Maybe my eyes were adjusting to the dark and playing tricks on me, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became. The door was no longer in the same position. It had shifted inward, slowly, just enough to narrow the opening, and I knew I hadn't touched it. My first instinct was to stay completely still. I didn't want to make noise, didn't want to draw attention to the fact that I was awake. My breathing felt louder than it should have, like it didn't belong in the silence of the room. I waited. Nothing else happened. No footsteps, no voices, no sudden movement. Just that same heavy quiet, like something was there but choosing not to reveal itself. After a minute, maybe longer, I forced myself to sit up. Every part of me wanted to stay where I was, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know what was causing it. I stood slowly, keeping my eyes on the doorway, expecting something to appear. Nothing did. I took a step forward, then another. The floor felt colder than had earlier, or maybe that was just how it felt in that moment. When I reached the door, I pushed it open the rest of the way. The hallway was empty. I stood there, listening, waiting for any sound that could explain what I had just seen. Still nothing. The bathroom door was slightly open, just like before. I pushed it wider, checked inside, empty. I turned toward the main living area. Everything looked exactly the same. But the feeling was different now. It wasn't just unease anymore. It was something sharper, more immediate. I walked slowly toward the front door, thinking about leaving right then without even packing anything, just getting out and figuring the rest out later. As I passed the wall near the kitchenette, something caught my attention. At first, it looked like a small gap in the paneling. A thin line, barely noticeable unless you were close to it. I stopped. That hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, and I just hadn't noticed. I leaned in slightly, looking closer. The line wasn't part of the design. It was too uneven, too subtle, and as I focused on it, I realized it wasn't just a line. It was a seam, something behind the wall. I hesitated, then reached out and pressed lightly against it. It moved, not much, just enough to confirm it wasn't fixed in place. A section of the wall shifted inward slightly, revealing a narrow opening. And behind it, darkness. My stomach dropped. I stepped back immediately, my mind racing to catch up with what I was seeing. There was space behind the wall. Not a full room, but enough for someone to stand. Enough for someone to move. That's when I noticed something else. Just inside the opening, barely visible, was a faint outline. Not clear, not defined, but enough to suggest that something had been there recently. Maybe still was. That was all it took. I didn't wait to confirm anything else. I turned, grabbed my keys and phone, and moved quickly to the door. My hands felt unsteady as I unlocked it, like they weren't responding fast enough. For a second, I thought about looking back. I didn't. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and walked as fast as I could to my car. I didn't stop until I was inside with the doors locked. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I started the engine and left without turning back. I didn't drive far at first, just far enough to get out of that neighborhood, far enough that the house wasn't visible anymore. I pulled over on the side of the road and sat there, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing down. Everything felt unreal. Not in a dramatic way, just disconnected. Like my mind hadn't fully caught up with what had just happened. I kept thinking about that space behind the wall. How small it was, how hidden. The way it wasn't visible unless you were standing in exactly the right spot. And the fact that it had moved. That part stayed with me the most. After a few minutes, I checked my phone and opened the booking details. I considered calling the host, asking directly, forcing some kind of explanation. But the thought of hearing his voice, of trying to act normal while asking about something like that, didn't feel right. Instead, I contacted the platform and told them I was leaving early. I didn't go into full detail. Just said the place didn't feel safe. They responded later, asking for more information. But by then, I had already decided I wasn't going back. I found a hotel instead and stayed there for the rest of the trip. Even there, it didn't feel the same. Every small sound stood out. Every movement in the hallway outside made me pause. I checked the door lock more times than I needed to. I kept the lights on longer than usual. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was something quieter, more persistent. Like the idea that privacy wasn't guaranteed anymore. That spaces you assume are even temporarily might not actually be. I never got a clear answer about what that hidden space was for, or if anyone had been using it. Maybe it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. And after that, places that used to feel safe never quite felt the same again. When I think about all of this now, what stands out isn't any single moment. It's how similar they all felt at the beginning. None of those situations started with fear. There was no obvious warning, no clear reason to be on edge. Each one felt ordinary, a simple interaction, a shared living space, a place that was supposed to be safe. And in each case, I trusted that feeling. I trusted the routine, the environment, the idea that nothing was wrong because nothing looked wrong. Looking back, the signs were there. Not obvious, Not enough to stop everything immediately, but enough that I remember them now in a different way. Small details that didn't quite fit, moments that felt slightly off, things that were easy to explain at the time. That's what makes it difficult. Because those explanations feel reasonable when you're in it. You tell yourself it's nothing, that you're overthinking, that there's always a logical answer. And most of the time there is, but not always. Sometimes the difference between a normal moment and something else is so small that you don't recognize it until you're already past it. That's the part that stays with me. Not what could have happened, but how close it felt without ever being clear. People always think they'll notice when something is wrong. But sometimes the only difference between normal and dangerous is realizing it too late.